My name is Anna Davis, and today I'll be presenting my senior thesis titled Loving the Least of These, Hospital Care for Infants with Neonatal Abstinence Syndrome. Imagine with me that you are living in a world where every light makes you convulse, and you feel as if there's an earthquake rumbling inside of you. Every sound causes your ears to burn, and all you want to do is scream to not face the pain that you are in. You begin crying uncontrollably and shaking. Nothing can make it cease, not even a hug from your favorite person. Imagine what this would be like. Imagine if this was your everyday life. The unfortunate reality of things is that for many infants across the world and in our country today, this is the case. When an infant is born addicted to an opioid, they are forced to face a terrible struggle called neonatal abstinence syndrome, which is a frightening situation for any mother and child who must endure it. Sadly, the prevalence of this issue has risen 433% between 2004 and 2014, and it has only continued to rise since. In 2018, the death rate from drug overdose in America was 17 people per 100,000. As you can see, drug addiction is rampant throughout our country and throughout the entire world. However, more specifically in America today, the opioid crisis has risen to outrageously high levels. What began in the 1990s by doctors trying to help their patients cope with pain quickly morphed into a monstrous predicament that is taking over our society. In 2016 alone, over 42,000 deaths were attributed to opioid overdose. As this issue continues to rise in our country, many people have heard about it. However, few people realize how far-reaching this issue truly is. Even fewer people care enough to influence the trajectory of this issue. What many people don't realize is that this opioid crisis not only affects the person using the drug, but it affects the entire community, including the youngest individuals of our society. When a mother is addicted to an opioid and becomes pregnant with a child, once that child is born, they are forced to face many struggles due to the withdrawal symptoms. While the opioid crisis as a whole must be dealt with, it is far too complicated to discuss in a single 20-minute presentation. Therefore, in my thesis, I will focus on how the opioid crisis directly influences the youngest individuals of our society. To fully realize the severity of this issue, one must first understand Neonatal Abstinence Syndrome, or NAS. NAS is a group of problems that present themselves after a child has been born addicted to an opioid. This often leads to a prolonged stay in the hospital and many additional health issues. Some of these present themselves directly after the child's birth, but others don't show up until much later in the child's life, such as an increased risk of heart defects and motor and cognitive impairments. As you can see, NAS has the potential to affect the child all the way through their adulthood. Therefore, we must find the best ways to care for these infants as effectively as possible directly after they are diagnosed with this disorder. Currently, there is no standard of care for an infant with NAS. Therefore, they are forced to stay in the hospital several days after they are born to be tested continually. One of these methods of care is called pharmacotherapy, which is the administration of drugs, additional drugs to the infant and sometimes the mother to help them cope with the pain of withdrawal and maintain healthy vitals within the infant. Methadone and morphine are the most commonly used drugs in this system. Methadone is a synthetic drug that can be given to the mother and the child, but it also causes some of the worst withdrawal pains within the child once they are born. Morphine is a powerful form of pain medicine that can be given to the child in different dosages to help them wean off the opioid they were addicted to. This method, along with several others, comprises systems that hospitals use to care for infants with NAS. However, these systems have much room for improvement. Therefore, in my thesis, I will describe each of the ways hospitals use to care for infants with NAS, point out the flaws present within these systems, and present possible reforms and solutions to implement. By doing so, I believe that you will see that in order to provide long-lasting solutions to NAS, we must reform these systems to make them more effective, efficient, economic, and ethical. As I mentioned earlier, NAS is a group of problems that present themselves after a child is born addicted to an opioid. However, to fully realize this issue, you must first understand the science that occurs within the infant's brain. When a baby is in its mother's womb, it receives all of its nutrients from their mother. That being said, when a mother takes an opioid, it travels through her body, penetrates her uterus walls, and makes its way to the child's brain. Within the child's brain, the opioid causes a large burst of dopamine to be released into the child's reward system. After several occurrences of this happening, the child begins to rely on this large burst of dopamine for satisfaction. Therefore, once the child is born and no longer has this constant intake of the drug, they are forced to suffer through the pains of withdrawal. Some of these symptoms of withdrawal include sensitivity to increased sensitivity to light and sound, anxiety, restlessness, even trouble breathing and eating. Therefore, these innocent children need the best care possible. To do so, hospitals care for infants with NAS in three main ways. These are pharmacotherapy, a lengthened hospital stay, and low stimuli environments. The first one, pharmacotherapy, is usually their initial effort. This is the administration of drugs to the infant to help them wean off of the opioid and maintain healthy vitals within themselves. The second form of care is a lengthened hospital stay. While this is a necessity for many children who are at risk for having NAS, it is often far too long for such a newborn child. The third form of care, a low stimuli environment, is not as common as the previous two. However, it is used in the hospital setting. These are rooms that are controlled with their light, the noise that the child is exposed to, and the amount of touch that they are exposed to. While not as common as the previous two, this is a very effective way to care for the infants. While none of these three methods of care are inherently wrong, there is much room for improvement. Therefore, I have found 4 flaws present within these hospital systems. The first one is that pharmacotherapy is often used as a first resort instead of a last resort. For these poor infants that are already having to suffer through a withdrawal, why give them excess amount of drugs when not absolutely necessary? Many infants are actually able to withstand their withdrawal symptoms without any additional drugs being introduced. If a baby is able to do without the drugs, let them do without the drugs. The second flaw is that the length of stay is often far too long for the infant. Now, many different factors play into this, but I believe that it can be shortened in just a few ways. For an average baby with no additional health issues, they are required to stay in the hospital for an additional 24 to 48 hours after birth. However, if a child is at risk for having NAS, they are often required to stay 8 to 10 times as much as this. The average stay for a baby with NAS is typically around 17 to 23 days. But with a few changes, I believe this can be shortened drastically. The third flaw is contributed to by both of the previous ones, and this is the outrageous cost of care for NAS. For a single NAS care stay, the cost is $45,000 at one hospital, but $90,000 at another. Despite this $45,000 difference, the outrageous cost needs to be cut down. Furthermore, many of the mothers who birth children with NAS are not financially stable enough to handle these costs alone. Therefore, Medicaid takes a huge burden from the cost of NAS care. In an article regarding NAS and its relationship to Medicaid, Dr. Tyler Winkleman states that in 2004, 73.7 NAS-related births were covered by Medicaid. However, in 2014, 82% of NAS-related births were covered by Medicaid. Furthermore, the prevalence of this issue increased significantly as well. In 2014, 2004, 2.8 babies per 1,000 were diagnosed with NAS. However, in 2014, 14.4 infants in 1,000 were diagnosed with NAS. Another thing is that the outrageous cost has risen significantly between the time that they studied. In 2004, it cost $65 million per year to care for NAS. But in 2014, Medicaid covered $462 million worth of NAS care. As you can see, throughout the time period that Tyler Winkleman studied along with his colleagues, this NAS and its relationship to Medicaid increased significantly in every aspect of it. But even scarier than that is that Medicaid is funded by taxpayers. This means that each one of us takes on a part of this cost onto ourselves. We must find a better way to care for these infants in a more effective way while also cutting down the cost drastically. Therefore, the last flaw found in the systems is that many of the infants that are born with NAS often return to the hospital later in life. This can be due to learning deficiencies and other health problems that may present themselves. But also, when an infant is born with addictive tendencies and are never helped to fully cope with those, it is likely that they will reveal themselves again later in life. Now, I am not saying that any child born with NAS will automatically become a heroin addict. However, I am saying that when an infant is born with addictive tendencies but never fully heals from those, it is likely that they will come back one day. However, we may not just end there. Realizing the flaws present within these hospital care systems for NAS must be supplemented with ways to reform these systems. The first reform that I will present is using pharmacotherapy as a last resort instead of a first resort. This would look like using non-pharmacologic treatments before ever administering additional drugs to the infant. Some of these would include low stimuli environments for the child, cuddling from parents whenever available, or volunteers when parents are not available, and breastfeeding when the mother is on her own treatment for the drug. At Yale New Haven's Children's Hospital, they saw this problem occur in their own city, so they decided to make a reform to their care of NAS. They implemented a new approach called the Eat, Sleep, Console approach, which looked like measuring how much the child could eat, how long they could sleep, and how long it took them to be consoled. If a child was able to eat more than 1 ounce per feeding, sleep longer than an hour undisturbed, and be consoled within 10 minutes, they were never given additional drugs, but they were only treated with non-pharmacological treatments. However, if the baby's symptoms were far too strong, they were given as low a dosage as possible to help them wean off of the opioid and cope with the pain of withdrawal. From implementing this, Yale New Haven found 3 major benefits. First of all, the amount of infants treated with drugs went down from 98% to only 14%. Additionally, their length of stay decreased from 23 days to only 10. And the cost of care went down from $45,000 to only $10,000. As you can see, these reductions are significant, especially in the cost of care and their length of stay. Similarly, at the Children's Hospital at Dartmouth-Hitchcock, they noticed a similar problem. They decided to focus on rooming the child on the inpatient floor rather than in the NICU whenever possible. They also administered non-pharmacologic treatments before any additional drugs were given to the infant. Just like Yale New Haven's Children's Hospital, they also saw a major decrease in their cost of care and their length of stay. The second reform that I am presenting is an additional alternate care program such as Lily's Place and Bridget's Path. These are centers that are open across America that are specifically for opioid-addicted children. They would go to the center after their initial hospital stay and receive care more specifically for opioid addiction than in the hospital. This would look like a low stimuli environment, just like the ones presented earlier. And this type of center focuses on the mother and child relationship. That way, when a mother is dealing with her own addiction, she can be treated for that while also learning how to care for her child. The third form of care does not have as much research as the previous two, but it has the potential to be revolutionary in the care of NAS. This is non-insertive acupuncture. For an infant with NAS, this would look like them coming into a doctor's office and getting acupunctured in several different spots around their body. This would help release tension and pressure from their bodies and release some of the pain of withdrawal. However, like I mentioned, there's not much research so far on this, so the previous two reforms would be more effective as of now. Some might say that these reforms would be far too expensive to implement within the hospital. However, the reality is quite the opposite. As you can see through both of the examples of the hospitals I presented earlier, the cost of care cut almost in half whenever non-pharmacologic treatments were presented before any additional drugs were supplemented. Additionally, a few of the non-pharmacologic treatments would not cost the hospital any money at all. Take breastfeeding, for example. When a mother is able to breastfeed her child while sticking with her own treatment, this would not cost the hospital anything, but it has been proven to be one of the most effective ways to care for the infant's withdrawal symptoms. As you can see, hospitals would not have to pay much to implement these reforms. However, in the future, they would save a fortune. In conclusion, while none of these three methods of care for infants with NAS are inherently wrong, they each have much room for improvement. If we have ways to do so, why would we not utilize those? When non-pharmacologic treatments were presented before any additional drugs, the cost of care was seen to cut in half. This is a huge decrease, especially in such a predicament as NAS, for most of the cost of NAS is cared for by Medicaid and the taxpayers that fund that. Additionally, some of these methods are very beneficial and give great encouragement for the mother to stick with her own treatment while still helping her baby heal from their withdrawal symptoms as well. For all these reasons, I believe that in order to provide long-lasting solutions to NAS in a more effective, economic, and ethical way, we must reform our hospital systems that care for infants with NAS. Thank you. At this time, I would like to answer any questions you might have.
What drew you to this topic? You're so passionate about it, and I just want to know what drew you to it.
Yes, ma'am. So, I had always thought about doing something that involved the opioid crisis, but I actually had no idea about neonatal abstinence syndrome at all until Ms. Bowe sent me an email with an article presenting the two alternate care programs that I mentioned in my thesis. And that kind of sparked my interest, and I started researching it. And I've always had a natural tendency to care for infants. At one point, I wanted to become an OBGYN just because I thought they got to play with babies all day, which, but yes, I just have always had like a natural tendency to care for infants. And when I realized that the opioid crisis affects them just as much as it does anyone else, I decided to pick it as my topic. Yes.
Excellent job. Really good understanding of how you structured it, and you offered a solution, and I really appreciate that. So speaking of the cost for when you shifted the
Pharmacological.
Yes, from a first response to a last, you showed the significance of that financially. What about these alternative care systems, these two homes? Did you look at the financial side of that and how that helped in the same way?
So each of those alternate care programs are nonprofits as of now, so they have to be like given money. I know one of the centers is in West Virginia, and the government has done some things to provide money to support that, but they're the only two existing as of now. So we would have to have more centers open up to really understand that fully.
So they are actually helping to alleviate the Medicaid because they're nonprofit?
Yes, ma'am, a
Okay.
little bit.
So I'm assuming that one of the reasons they give these babies drugs is to save their lives. How do they know where they are in terms of the danger of death?
So there are different ways that hospitals test the infants. Like I said, there's no standard care, which makes it difficult to have like a certain way that they test every single infant. But I do know that whenever a baby is born, their symptoms are very vocal, like the crying uncontrollably, shaking. So I think it's very evident just by looking at the infant whether they're like closer to death or not. But I would say that that's one of the reasons that I propose to not start with drugs as the first resort, because you really don't know until the baby is like a few days older whether or not they're closer to death.
I guess two other questions. One, it seems like in the population that would be addicted to opioids, there'd be a lot less presence in terms of motherly presence. I guess is that a challenge? Did you find that in your research, that kind of thing?
So my research didn't directly lead me to that, but I have thought about it a lot just because many mothers who are addicted to opioids are planning to give their child up for adoption or aren't really willing to go through their own treatment to care for their infant. So that's why I kind of focused on the mother being a part of the treatment, because I think it does provide great encouragement for her when she sees her child suffering through all of this stuff to stick with her own treatment and get clean so she can take care of her own infant. But when that doesn't happen, there are many programs within hospitals that allow volunteers to come in and kind of substitute as the motherly figure for the infant. And one of the major parts of like the healing process of the infant is for them to be like constantly held. And so if volunteers could come in the hospitals and do that, that would be very beneficial.
Now, I guess the last question, it seems like the hospitals that you looked at in your paper were research hospitals, so New Haven and Dartmouth. How would a NAS case be handled locally, probably?
My research didn't lead me directly to that just because it is more prevalent in like the northeast of America, but I think that many of these different reforms I presented could be implemented easily into one of our local hospitals because it doesn't cost a lot of money to have volunteers come in or have the mother stick around whenever she's working on her own treatment and things like that. So I think it would work in a local hospital as well.
Thank you.
If there are no further questions, I would like to thank you all for your attention today. And if you think of any further questions later on, feel free to email me at annadavis513@gmail.com. Thanks again.